Next, we'll be looking at two key concepts in conditioning for hockey, which is maximal aerobic speed and the anaerobic speed reserve. You may have heard these terms. The main thing we're looking at here is a series of calculations that enable us to determine overall someone's running profile, and from that how we can actually prescribe. So now I've looked at some more kind of higher level things, such as the purpose of assessment, the physical demands of hockey, and how to individualise. Now we can actually look at how we actually prescribe for an individual athlete. And this will include how to individualise for a single athlete and also for a team or a series of athletes as well. Also, don't forget, as part of this section, you get a number of free training guides. Along with this, you get the maximal aerobic speed calculator and the anaerobic speed reserve calculator as well. So make use of those, because it makes your life so much easier when it comes to calculating all of these different running distances and that kind of thing. So it's all done for you already. All you need to do is just plug the numbers in once you've done the tests. So let's get going. So as a recap, maximum aerobic speed is the lowest speed at which VO2 max occurs. So it's a proxy measure for aerobic capacity. So it's not a direct measure. That would require things like gas analysis in a lab, but it's a simple, low-cost and reliable means of assessing someone's aerobic capacity, which is a key part of hockey performance. So we'll be looking into in a second how we determine this, what some normative data looks like for mass scores, and how that relates to things like a 16 pitch length time. But overall, that's the key thing to begin with, that it's the lowest speed at which VO2 max occurs. So the higher it is, the longer it's going to take for an athlete to reach their VO2 max, which means they've got more capacity, it's going to be less costly, and overall going to be less fatigued and able to perform at a higher level for longer. In terms of relationship to performance, in this section what I've done is just included research from other sports, because there isn't a huge amount in hockey, so there are many parallels from other sports. So I'm hoping that this will just provide a bit more of a broader overview of some of the relationship to performance from other sports, because there are almost certainly parallels that can be drawn, and we can make some inferences that if there's a beneficial effect in one sport, that it is likely to be of benefit in hockey too. So the first one here is that mass has been correlated with total running distances achieved in rugby union players. So in effect, the higher the mass score, the greater the distance that was covered by the players on the pitch. So in other words, their workload is higher. They can get around the pitch more. And the more you can be involved in the game, the more impact you can have, the more you can contribute towards point scoring opportunities. Ultimately, the better impact you can have as a player. Imagine for a second you've got a player who fatigues quite quickly, or towards the end of the game has just hit their sort of physical limit, if you like. They're going to very quickly deteriorate in terms of their physical outputs and therefore their contribution to the game. So it might have to be substituted or something along those lines. So going back to the philosophy of we want our best players available all the time, if we can increase maximum aerobic speed, then we can ultimately increase aerobic capacity, work capacity, and the ability to impact the game for longer, which of course is hugely important. Then in terms of the kind of research around different scores, so Baker and Heaney did a paper that looked at a sort of whole cross-section of different sports, playing levels, males and females, which is really, really helpful for having a kind of reference point. First point to make, though, is that a lot of the mass scores, as you'll see, were determined by multi-stage fitness tests or yo-yo tests. So it's not the same, for example, as doing a 16 pitch length run, which is more of a time trial. Some were, so you can see there, for example, there was a 2 kilometre time trial completed here in Aussie rules. So we can have some sort of reference point. So just keep in mind that if you're looking at hockey players, for example, here at Hockey Australia International Males, that this was completed in the multi-stage fitness test, and so is likely to be a little bit higher potentially than a 16 pitch length run. So what they did was looked at different kind of scores of different sports and then rank them to see kind of where sports sat. So overall, the trend was the higher the playing level, the higher the mass score required. And in middle distance runners, scores of 6.2, which is world class, were achieved, and that makes sense because that is their sport, that's the domain they operate in, and they are excellent at exactly that, running at these sorts of speeds. And then as you went down the list, we had endurance runners and triathletes, and then we got into Aussie rules, Series A soccer in Italy, hockey internationals here, Gaelic football and rugby, and so they kind of ranked them here. As you can see, hockey came out pretty high overall, kind of around the 4.8 for hockey Australian internationals. And then across different sports, sort of field-based sports, if you like, so removing now things like middle distance running, which is kind of like an unfair comparison. Brazilian futsal came out pretty high, but then you can see here Australian national team around 4.8, 4.48 for kind of national level players, and then state level players high again at a 4.8. So generally speaking, hockey comes out as requiring a very high mass score at the elite level, which goes in line with the fact that it's a very high running demand, which we already know. In terms of perceived exertion, some research by Gallo et al. Found that for every 5 seconds that an AFL player was behind a teammate, so if they did a time trial in 2 kilometres, every 5 seconds that they were behind the next player added 1 RPE score to a tactical pitch session. And just to break that down into kind of layman's terms, an RPE score is a very simple score out of 10, or sometimes out of 20, which ranks how hard the session was. So the lower the score, the more easy the perceived effort of the pitch session. So what they found was for every 5 seconds slower in a time trial test, i.e. the lower the maximal aerobic speed score, a whole point was increased during a tactical pitch session. So in other words, players who are fitter find tactical pitch sessions easier in AFL players, and that would broadly apply to hockey. That makes a lot of sense. You can imagine, players who are fitter will perceive hockey pitch sessions as being physically less costly, and that makes a lot of sense. So an important one to take home from this sort of research here is that if we can increase mass overall, not only do we know that we can increase things like total distances achieved, but we can also reduce the perceived exertion required during hockey pitch sessions. In other words, we are able to tolerate a greater workload, work at higher intensity, and perform higher intensity pitch sessions, which is a really beneficial thing. Clearly, we want to be training as hard as we can without it affecting the ability of players to recover and go again. How do we assess it? There's a couple of ways we can do this, but one of the simplest ways that we can do it is using a time trial assessment, and this is a simple method for assessing this. A time trial should be around 5 to 7 minutes in duration in order to have an effective determination of mass. If we use something like a 1 or 2 minute run, the score achieved will be very, very high, but it will also be a highly anaerobic score. It will, based on the duration, not really account for mass. It will be an anaerobic score that we achieve there. So something around the 5 to 7 minute mark is required for determination of mass reliably. So we can either use a time-based time trial, which could be a 5 minute continuous run, where the athlete aims to run for as far as they can in that time period, or more typically a distance-based time trial, which could be a 16 hockey pitch lengths run, which is something that I'm a proponent of. Sometimes a 10 pitch lengths is used, but again, if we go back to the 5 to 7 minute time frame, it's possibly a little bit short for that. So those are 2 options. The simplest one, though, is just obviously if you just know you've got to run 16 pitch lengths, just run it as fast as you can. It's psychologically a little bit more manageable than 5 minutes, where no matter how hard you run, the time never speeds up. Whereas at least with the distance, you can actually influence the outcome and make it shorter, but the harder you work. So that's an interesting one there to consider, but those are 2 kind of simple options to use. Now, in terms of standards, just move myself out of the way. These are standards, again, back from Baker and Heaney, and they looked at a comparison of sort of men's and women's from a various, sort of range of different sports to establish some norms, essentially. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the men's scores. Again, sort of futsal came out pretty high here, and what you can see here is that Australian national and Scottish national hockey teams were sitting at around a 4.8 metres per second score. And that kind of equates to around a 5 minute a 3 a and that equates to around a 5 minute 2 to 5 minute 5 16 pitch lengths run. So really, really quick. So we can take from that a good standard for international men's hockey would be pushing 5 minutes and below, which would be really, really good. And then you can see that obviously the lower the playing level, again, the lower the score became. On the women's side, scores were in the sort of Australian National League, 4.58, which is sitting at around sort of like a 525 to 520 kind of ballpark here across different scores. And again, as you can see, the score began to drop as the sort of level of competition dropped. So, for example, there's like a sub-elite squad here, 4.2, hockey national team 4.4, elite Australian hockey 4.4, and then finally the hockey national league at 4.58. So you can see there's incremental increases in the mass score. Now, to calculate 16 pitch length equivalent, you just divide 1462, that's the meters that the test is, by the score listed to work out what an equivalent time would be in order to achieve that score. But just remember that some of these were determined using things like a yo-yo or a multi-stage fitness test, so aren't directly applicable. There may be a little bit of variation there in some of the scoring, but it does give a good sort of ballpark. So we could basically say that as a ballpark figure for elite level, 5 minutes in the 16 pitch lengths for male players and 5:25 and below for women would be a very good score to aim for. And you can obviously just kind of match your score to what it lists out here as well. So it's a useful frame of reference. Unfortunately, there isn't huge amounts of available data for 16 pitch lengths run for kind of sub-elite levels. But broadly speaking, a good ballpark would be for men's players around 5:30 and for female players around 6 minutes. Those would be good ballpark figures to aim for if you're trying to aim for something as a target for 16 pitch lengths. Pros and cons of this approach. Pros is it's easy to administer. Very simply, what we have to do is just run 16 lengths of the pitch. You can prescribe directly from the test. You can prescribe from mass directly. You just have one number and you can do lots of calculations from it, and you can provide very individual distances based off of it. And it's really scalable at high numbers. So whether you're working with 5, 10 or 20 athletes, you can very simply execute the test. And again, if you think back to the assessment section where I went into more detail on the 16 pitch lengths, the administration test is actually pretty straightforward. Cons, though, it's a little hard to optimize physiologically, and I'll be going into that in the 30-15 and anaerobic speed reserve sections. But in effect, it doesn't account for maximal sprint speed as well. And if you had two players with the same mass score, but one is faster, they will be working at a smaller percentage of the anaerobic speed reserve. So it's not equitable in terms of the physiological cost across the different players. It doesn't provide much for a change of direction assessment either. Obviously, there are change of directions in it, and it's a kind of a bit where you do obviously lose the most amount of speed, but it doesn't really challenge change of direction at any sort of appreciable speeds. So whereas if there's something like a 30-15 towards the end and you're doing very high speed interval work with a change direction, it becomes a little closer to the demands of hockey. So you could argue it's a little bit more specific in terms of the physiological demand. And this is this kind of trade-off again between logistics and physiology. And you just have to determine and make a kind of informed decision about which is the most applicable for my setting. And am I trying to optimize this or just satisfy the need to have a useful test as a frame of reference? And for most, that second point there about having an easy, simple to administer test that you can prescribe from is more than enough. And so that's why 16 pitch length can be a very useful means of testing. And finally, on the con side, prescribing from percentage of ASR is challenging because ultimately, you need to have then also do a top speed run as well. And sometimes trying to set up a speed gate to get a 30 to 40 meter split time on top of doing 16 pitch lengths can be one thing too many. And it just means that in order to prescribe from anaerobic speed reserve, it's just one extra thing you have to do. So it can be a little challenging in that sense. But overall, if you just do the 16 pitch lengths, it's very easy to administer. So calculating running distances from mass very simple, this one. Step 1, you just need to divide the distance of the time trial by the time achieved in seconds, or vice versa if you're going to do a time-based time trial. So, for example, 1462 meters, which is 16 lengths of a hockey pitch, divide by 360 seconds. If you ran this in 6 minutes, would give you a score of 4.06. And if you remember back, achieving a 5:02 was equivalent to around a 4.8 meters per second mass score. Step 2, then, very simply, take the mass score in meters per second, multiply it by the running intensity that you wish to run at, and then multiply it by the interval duration, and that will give you your prescribed distance. So, for example, taking this score times by 90% of mass score, and I'll give you within complete hockey conditioning, within the calculators, there's a whole range of different prescriptions that you can use for this that are relevant to the duration of the interval. But very typically 120 seconds, which is a 2-minute interval, you'd probably be looking at something like a 90% mass percentage, because it's below maximal aerobic speed, and trying to run far at maximal aerobic speed for 2 minutes and doing it in repeated fashion is a pretty challenging prescription. So typically 90% would be outright. So you would therefore have a target of 438 meters. You could also do this as a range. Ranges are often very helpful. It might be 90 to 95% of mass, which would be then 438 to whatever that prescription would be for the individual. So very, very simple way of prescribing using just mass alone. A couple of example conditioning sessions then. You've got short intervals, something like 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off is a very kind of classical maximal aerobic speed session. A running speed of 105% of mass, a prescription of 3 sets of 8 repetitions with 3 minutes recovery between sets. So an athlete would run 30 seconds at 105% of mass, rest for 30 seconds, perform another 7 reps, rest for 3 minutes, and then perform another 2 sets of that. And the target would be 128 meters if the athlete's mass is 4.06. That would be their target to aim for. In long intervals, which is typically anything over sort of 2 minutes to 5 minutes, sometimes 6, running speed at 90% again, so we've already done the maths on this one, you'd probably be looking at around 5 to 6 sets, 2 minutes rest per interval, and a distance target there of 438 meters if the athlete's mass score is 4.06. Okay, so 2 example sessions there of how we can prescribe just off of that very simple 16 pitch lengths run. And if you're then looking at multiple athletes, let's say we've got 5 athletes on a program for, again, all the calculations are done for you within the mass calculator, so you can just plug the numbers in and it will prescribe multiple sessions for you, so don't worry about doing all of this yourself. But if we had a range here of, say, 4 to 4.4, 3.6, you would then have a range of different distances to aim for, and all the athletes would have a different individualized running distance that they're trying to achieve within that time frame of 2 minutes. And again, just to recap, that would be mass times by 90% times by 120 for this long interval session. So super, super simple. If you want to do another short interval session, you could then do 15 seconds at 115% of mass. And generally speaking, at 120% of mass is about where things start to get a bit too fast, and you then have to start prescribing for maximal sprint speed. So this is kind of pushing at some relatively fast speeds now. Again, the same group of athletes there, all 5, would have an individualized distance target, ranging from 62 at the bottom there to 76 here. And again, that would be mass times 115%, because it's 150% of mass, times by the 15-second duration will give you this based on this. Again, check the calculators for an easy means of determining all of these things. And then just visually, just to make life kind of simple and self-explanatory, if you had all 5 athletes lined up then, and again you can scale this out to more than just 5, if they were doing 15 seconds, the whistle would go on 0, they would have a cone set up at their distance target right here, so you'd have 5 different cones at different distances. When the whistle then blew on 15 seconds, their aim would be to have achieved that distance in that time. They then probably walk a little distance and back for 15 seconds, whistle would go again, and then they'd repeat all the way back to the start line from their start going different distances. So because they've all got different mass scores, they also have different prescriptions, and that just means that everything is equitable in terms of the prescription. However, as we said already, this doesn't account for the anaerobic speed reserve. So even though, let's say, these two players here have got a relatively similar, maybe these two here, got very similar-ish mass score, one might be significantly faster and actually their cruising speed is higher, so they would actually find it a little easier than the other. So just something to consider there, which we'll be looking at shortly. So anaerobic speed reserve, this then takes it to another level. And one thing with this is that it's a little bit more complex in terms of the calculations, but again, I've done the anaerobic speed reserve calculator for you, so all of the maths you don't need to worry about, you just need to worry about the tests that are involved. Anaerobic speed reserve, which is also known as the anaerobic velocity reserve, is the difference between an athlete's maximal sprint speed, so the fastest velocity they can achieve, and their maximal aerobic speed. So if an athlete has a score of 10 meters per second as a sprint score and 4 meters per second as their maximum aerobic speed score, they would have an anaerobic speed reserve of 6 meters per second. And that would be their anaerobic capacity there. So in terms of calculating anaerobic speed reserve, as I've said here, you take the maximal sprint speed, you take away maximal aerobic speed. So for example, 9 minus 4 gives you 5. And then very simply to prescribe from this, you take a percentage of ASR, add it to mass. So for example, if you wanted to run at 10% of anaerobic speed reserve, this would be 5, which is their zone, times by 10%, add on their maximum aerobic speed score, and that will give you a running speed to aim for. So for example, if you're going to do 30 seconds at 10% of anaerobic speed reserve, you then do 30 times by 4.5 to give you a more accurate prescription. But again, I'll just be able to visualize this to make your life a little simpler in a second. If at any time, by the way, on this in this section there are bits which you're not too sure of, obviously just pause and go back. There are supplementary articles as well to add a little bit more detail, so don't worry if the content feels a little bit much at certain points. Just make sure you go back over, and you can also drop me a message at any point if you are a little unsure. But just in terms of the relationship to performance now, there's a few bits of research here just demonstrating from other sports how anaerobic speed reserve can be immensely valuable in terms of a direct performance impact. The first one from Boucher and Larson found that athletes with a higher anaerobic speed reserve showed lower neuromuscular impairments and RPE again during high intensity interval training. So the greater the anaerobic speed reserve, which we said is a combination of their mass score and maximal sprint speed score, the lower the neuromuscular impairments and the RPE, so basically the less neuromuscular fatiguing a session will be, and also their perception of the difficulty will be lower during high intensity interval work. And this kind of makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because you're working at a relatively smaller percentage there. Time to exhaustion is more accurately predicted by percentage of anaerobic speed reserve and not percentage of mass at events up to 8 minutes in duration. And 88% of the variance in performance was explained by anaerobic speed reserve workload here. So if we take things like fighting sports, combat sports, and interestingly hockey rotations, which typically last around 8 minutes, then actually anaerobic speed reserve accounts for potentially more of the variance in the performance there than mass alone. So if we're only assessing mass, we don't necessarily account for the thing which is the biggest determinant of performance in events up to 8 minutes. Now that is obviously slightly making an inference from that information, but it makes logical sense in some ways, because if you think about two athletes with the same mass score on the pitch, but one's got a higher maximal sprint speed score, it probably is safe to assume that the athlete will find repeated high intensity efforts that little bit easier. And then finally, anaerobic speed reserve is a bigger determinant of 800 meter running performance at the elite level compared with sub-elite. So again, what that essentially shows is that mass will be a big determinant at sub-elite levels. So it becomes a differentiating factor up to a point, and then it stops becoming a determinant of performance, because typically what will happen is that everyone's going to hit a certain point where it's hard to make any significant gains beyond that compared to or relative to your other competitors. So then your anaerobic speed reserve becomes the differentiating factor. So, and this is probably going to be similar at different sporting levels and different sports in general. At the low level, just being aerobically fitter is going to be have a big impact on performance. But up to a point, everyone's then at a similar level of aerobic fitness, and it's that anaerobic speed reserve which becomes the key differentiator. Okay, to represent this visually again, athlete A and athlete B both have got their mass and maximal sprint speed scores outlined here. Again, the blue bar represents the anaerobic speed reserve, which is this green section. The top line is the maximal sprint speed score, and this here is their mass score. It should say mass. The 5 meters per second line here then just represents what is a threshold for high speed running. And again, as you can see, this athlete is going to be running at a much, much smaller percentage of that reserve, and so it's going to find it a lot easier to work at high intensity. And we can do the same thing all the way up to, let's say, 7.5. For this athlete, they're almost maxing out here, whereas this athlete A, has still got a decent capacity left. So that's the kind of visual representation of the value of having a fit athlete who's also got a high maximal sprint speed score. So then in terms of the consistency of prescription, one of the important things is if you're writing a program for lots of athletes, that everyone is essentially getting, relatively speaking, the same intensity or same challenge in terms of difficulty. We're hoping that we're all going to respond physiologically in a similar way. When we only prescribe for mass, there's a huge variation because we don't account for the anaerobic speed reserve. But when we do account for it, the variability massively reduces down. So Julio et al. Found less inter-athlete variability in lactate scores and time to exhaustion in rugby players and long-distance runners when prescribing from anaerobic speed reserve. So basically it keeps a more consistent physiological response in a group of athletes, which is what we want. So imagine you're prescribing for a group. The important thing is that they all have a similar physiological response, because that means that the stimulus that is being provided is going to provide a similar adaptation, or at least the adaptation that we want. Obviously, these things are not 1 + 1 = 2 type equations, but it's on a similar path. It's what we're hoping to achieve, whereas just mass alone probably won't give us that level of prescription. Okay, pros and cons. It's essentially the flip side of just using mass. It is more consistent physiological responses, as we've said, so people will respond, generally speaking, more uniformly when we've got that accounted for. As bigger performance determinants at elite levels, so if you are working at elite level, then ASR is probably going to be a bigger impactor on performance. It's going to give more accurate prescription because it actually accounts for top sprint speed, which, as we've already sort of ascertained, is very, very important. The cons, though, are around the kind of logistics and practicalities of it. It's hard to optimize logistically. If you've got a lot of athletes to work with, then trying to do a flying 10-meter sprint time can be a little difficult with large numbers. It's complicated mathematically, hence why I've given you the calculator to just kind of do that all for you. And again, it involves more assessment, so it becomes a little bit more tricky there. But if we just look at kind of programming for multiple athletes, I've got 2 athletes here, athlete A and athlete B. We're going to do a 30-second interval session at 10% of the anaerobic speed reserve. Athlete A's scores are listed out here. So they've got this is the mass score, that's the max sprint speed score. This one minus this one gives you 5.41. So 5.41 times by 10% gives you 0.54. And then we add that to their mass score of 3.68. And then we're going to times that by 30 seconds. You can see the kind of extra level of calculations required. We then get 127 meters. Athlete B, on the other hand, has a mass score of 4.43, a top speed of 7.14, and so a smaller anaerobic speed reserve. But interestingly, their prescription will be a little different now. And broadly speaking, that's because of the mass score, again, being different. This is the kind of subtleties of prescription, because we account for not just mass, but also top speed. And so the difference in prescription there is accounted for by a higher maximal aerobic speed score. So Finally, there are free training guides in this section to help you. So the anaerobic speed reserve calculator is designed to give you all of the calculations done for you if you want to prescribe more physiologically accurately by accounting for anaerobic speed reserve. That will do it all for you. If you just want to use maximal aerobic speed, then this one here will do that for you as well. The anaerobic speed reserve calculator does obviously incorporate mass into it though, so you can use that as well. And then complete hockey conditioning is my guide that goes into conditioning in more detail, again providing you with again frameworks and the same kind of thought process I've provided in this course, but just in a simple guide, so you can kind of take that with you and help that with your training prescriptions overall. So use those to really help you, because some of these calculations, as I said, are a little tricky. Lots of references in this section, so I've listed them all out for you. If you're interested in learning any more about the specific areas, have a look. I particularly recommend the Sanford paper around anaerobic speed reserve, which is excellent. So have a little look through all of those. Finally, what we're going to look at in this section is the 30-15 test and how we can use that to, again, optimize the prescription, some of the challenges, some of the pros and cons of using that test, and we'll tie it all together then around how we can individualize training prescription. So hope that's been useful in terms of consolidating information around maximal aerobic speed and anaerobic speed reserve. As I say, there are a little bit of areas of complexity to it, and it does require a few times going through it. So don't just watch this once, try to go through a couple of times and use the task to help you in terms of guiding you through how to build out effective conditioning sessions.